Hello testers and welcome to another STP community webinar. My name is James, I'm the event coordinator here at STP, and we are excited to have everyone on the webinar today. Ben O'Connor is joining us from Arlington, Virginia, and he'll be talking about mob testing and how it can improve your future development process, so stick around. A few things to go over before we get started today. Coming to you from STP, how to build a successful automation framework with BDD in mind with Thomas Hager. Join Thomas in this 2-day virtual workshop where attendees will learn how to write automated scenarios, handle test data, implement continuous integration with Jenkins, create standards around test development, and build a test automation framework capable of supporting behavior-driven development. The virtual workshop will take place over 2 days, Wednesday, June 9th and Wednesday, June 16th, from noon to 4 p.m. Eastern each day, and you can visit SoftwareTestPro.com to learn more about and register for Thomas's workshop. A reminder that our next scheduled webinar is on June 2nd from Ryan Reska, where he goes into depth about cookie consent and how you can test across multiple languages and browsers. Be sure to visit SoftwareTestPro.com to register for this webinar and check out other webinars coming up later this year from STP. Looking to practice your speaking and presentation skills or have an idea for a webinar topic, STP is looking for both new and veteran speakers and is currently filling the second half of the 2021 community webinar schedule. So submit your proposal today at SoftwareTestPro.com. If you're on social media and talking about today's webinar, be sure to tag us at SoftwareTestPro and use the hashtag STPWebinar. Also give Ben a follow while you're at it, at Ben O'Connor. All right, with that, everyone, please welcome Ben. We're excited to have you today on our community webinar series. You now have control, and the floor is all yours.
Excellent, thank you. Let me go ahead and share the window here. Excellent. Let me pull up my notes real quick. So hello, welcome everyone. I hope you all are enjoying your day so far. For me here, it just got recently sunny, so I'm pretty excited about that. Get a little natural lighting in. Welcome to my talk, Creating a Mob, a New Tester's Journey to Getting People Together to Test. All right, so thank you everyone for coming to the talk here. So my name is Ben O'Connor. I am at Storyblocks. So Storyblocks is a stock subscription-based website. We are the first and primary one out there. I have been with Storyblocks for about 6 years now, and I started in the customer support team. I've been doing this for quite some time. So we provide stock content for stock video, stock audio, and stock images. So what is stock content, you ask? Well, so stock content is, let's say you are making a video and you need one of the shots of a TV show of a major city like this, or you need a marketing team that looks like it's a super fighting force that is going to 100% get your ad spend taken care of, or you need an image of a dinosaur riding a shark, but you do not have the budget to get a dinosaur on a shark. Well, that's kind of where we come in here. So before I was in customer service, I've spent about the last 15 years previous to this helping the customers of the world. I actually started on the customer support team for Storyblocks, and I moved over to the engineering team. Basically, we decided to move our testing team in-house, and I was fortunate enough to be the person that they came in and reached out to directly. So what will we cover today? So what I'm going to go over today, I'm going to go over my journey as to how I became a software tester and how I went into using mob or group testing as a tool for my organization. I will start by reviewing some of the common issues that I encountered, kind of what led me to mob testing. Then I will go into what a good mob testing session looks like and what the experience should look like when you're doing the testing. I'll go into the good and bad, the benefits I found for implementing mob testing as a regular part of the feature development process, such as being able to maintain or decrease the total number of bugs that we have in our engineering team. And then finally, I'll go over some tips for the benefits of using it with the web sessions now, how everyone's doing it remotely. I definitely want to make sure I'm covering kind of what it looks like in a remote world. So let me take you back. This is about 3 years ago. I'd been the only designated tester at the time for a few months now. So still relatively new, but I had come from a non-technical background with testing just kind of being something that I found interesting. I was starting to get the feel for the norms, and I was understanding the expectations around testing. But there was one thing that seemed to keep coming up whenever I was testing large or medium new features through the entire site. And it's what I call kind of a negative feedback loop between stakeholders and myself. So a feature would be ready to test. At the time, it kind of felt like it was being tossed over a metaphorical wall for me to look at after seeing not too much from it earlier. And when I would go to test said feature, I normally would pull up the design, I'd pull up the requirements, the testing branch, and any other relevant documents or information that I needed to check. But upon pulling it up, I'd load the testing environment, I'd read over the requirements, and I'd look over the design to get an idea, and I would see the new feature that we're seeing on the page didn't match the design that was provided to me, or it didn't match the requirements that was provided. So I would look at it and see there's some discrepancies between the two. I would look at the JIRA ticket to see, like, is there any updates? Is there any new information I'm not seeing? And I wouldn't see anything there. It just looked like there wasn't any comments going on as far as like what should be happening there. So I would reach out. I'd go, okay, fine. Let me reach out to the engineer. I'll see what's going on here. And then when I reached out to the engineer, they would look it over. Sometimes they would say, that's interesting. And they tell me they weren't sure what was happening, but they were going to go off the design provided to them. And they thought that's what was supposed to have the most recent copy updates and the most recent information. Other times, they made some changes based off a conversation that they had with a stakeholder, such as a product manager or a design. And since they felt that this was like the most recent version, they thought they had the most recent updates on there. For now, I should go ahead and log any cases I am seeing on our bug tracking sheet. And so I thought, okay, I'll go back into the swing of things. I put all the information down and wait to hear back to see what happens. So engineers would eventually get back to me, and at a later time, or they would comment on the sheet. And it often turned out that one of a few things happened. I found that there were decisions that were being made by product or design or stakeholders where they decided on a design together or wanted to make some last minute changes, but they neglected to update the requirements, which I was supposed to use as a source of truth for testing. Or they might decide the design is the new source of truth and that there's no need to update the requirements any longer. I felt like the link of the communication there that we had, that it was broken. So I'll speak to kind of an example. One of the first examples I had where this really happened. We were rebranding our company to what we are today, which is Storyblocks. Previously, we were 3 sites: Video Blocks, Audio Blocks, and at the time it was Graphic Stock, which became Storyblocks Images. For this big rebrand, we were making our 3 separate domains look like one. So we're working to update our visual identity on things like buttons, things like colors, and on one of the products, we wanted to make sure it matched the other 2 products that had already been updated. The new layout had buttons being updated to have the image, the white outline, and the white text. The design still showed the old layout at the top, but the requirements mentioning updating it to look more like that of at the bottom. So I reached out to ask what was going on, and I was told to add it to the list and they'd find out. So after taking some time to kind of investigate, I found out that the items that were supposed to be updated here were being done in a separate ticket later by another engineer, and that there probably should have been some other communication there that wasn't happening. Generally just miscommunication. I don't know if all of you felt this way before, but I feel like this is an appropriate stock photo of what I was feeling at the time. As you can imagine, it's a pretty frustrating experience, and it felt like it was happening rather frequently. As this time, I was the only tester for numerous teams, and I often had to juggle testing a few projects at once. So if there's a delay due to me waiting to find out what was ultimately looking for on one project, it might cause a delay with other projects that I needed to test. And as I mentioned, since I was the main sign-off point for deployment in a lot of these cases, it meant other projects are going to take longer to ultimately get out to the customer. Waiting on communication and others to clarify things takes time. Adding poor communication that takes numerous steps takes even more time. Not to mention, when your goal is to deploy features to customers quickly, which all of us in the engineering world and testing world, that is our ultimate goal. It's costly. And in my opinion, it's an unnecessary bottleneck for all parties involved. And the example I gave, since I was seeing other examples similar to this, I decided to try gathering everyone in the room. I sat them down and I said, let's go over this together. And that is pretty much what led me to mob testing. So what is mob testing? Mob testing originates from the practice of mob programming, which is an idea by Woody Zuhl, which is a whole team approach to development and expands on the ideas of strong style pairing by Lewin Falco. The whole team works on the same thing at the same time on the same computer in the same space. It's an extension of this idea of pair programming and involves working together on not only programming, but things like writing user stories, working with customers for feedback, designing the product, testing, and then deploying the feature. Mob testing grew out of this. It's popularized by Marit Puharvi, which is where I learned about it myself when I was looking at the Ministry of Testing page, which if you're testers and haven't checked it out, it's a really great resource for that. So mob testing at its base is testing with a group of people, ideally 6 to 10 people with assigned roles using a single computer. So why 6 to 10? So with few two people, there aren't enough people to fill the prescribed role and give input. If you have too many people, it can get confusing and it get really messy as you can only have so much being done in a single session. So let's say that you had the larger number. Let's say you had 20 people and everyone provides an idea. Well, if you're to go through every single idea, it's not going to fit into a reasonable amount of time. Not to mention, if every single person wants to feel like they're valued and that their input matters, that's not likely to happen either. You can't get to every single case. And some of the people who you're inviting who may have been there for the first time, those people are going to say, well, I went, my opinion wasn't heard. Why am I going to do this again? On average, our sessions were coming in about 8 people or so. They've been lower due to doing the sessions remotely, but that's kind of where we started out. And that seemed to be a really good point just generally for where to shoot for. So mob testing is broken up into assigned roles. These are the driver, the navigator, the note taker, and the mob. So let's start talking about the driver. The driver is the person on the computer who is controlling the device. They are clicking with the mouse, inserting the text, navigating through the program, and doing the main action. The important aspect of the driver's job is they aren't thinking, they are just doing. The navigator is the person who is the facilitator, and they direct the driver on what to do. So if the mob session has numerous suggestions for an action to take, the navigator determines which one the driver should do at the time. In between steps, they should be the one reading off what the driver should do next, based on the guides you have. So if you have something like a testing plan, a charter, or something that you're using to kind of guide your actions. Now, the navigator role generally does not change and is often the person who organized the testing session. So a lot of the times I was the person who would be the navigator. Then you have the note taker. They have 2 roles. They should keep track of suggestions that the mob comes up with so you can check them off as you go, as well as log any notes about things you're finding. They track bugs or confusing experiences there, and they write them in an area where you can access it. Traditionally in person, this is done on a whiteboard. But as a lot of the sessions are online now, with everything being remote, I highly recommend using a shared document for kind of tracking the suggestions. You want to be sure to use a process and software everyone's familiar with. So if your company uses Google Sheets or Notion or Confluence or whatever that is, make sure all of you are using that particular thing. You don't want to have something where it's difficult for someone to learn that, go in for the first time and say, hey, I'm not sure how to do this, especially if they're trying to be the note taker. So having that common resource kind of helps there. While the note taker is busy taking notes, they are still able to provide suggestions for what actions the mob should take. So they can say, hey, I just saw that, can we try this out? And then it's up to the navigator to determine if that's the best idea. And then everyone else who's not included in that group, that's the mob. Their job is to pay attention to what the driver is doing, call out things they notice, ask questions, and suggest things that should be done outside of the plan. So traditional mob sessions involve a trade-off of the roles with a recommended change about every 4 minutes, but this is completely up to you. You could base that on an event. You could base it on testing a particular feature or a part of a testing plan, or an entirely different part of the project if you're switching from one to another. If you find everyone's participating equally, no one wants to take a certain role over, and the balance is feeling right to you, the person kind of organizing this, keep it as is. We switch roles kind of as needed based off how the flow of the session's going. So, if it feels like opinions aren't being valued and it feels like the person who's in a role isn't really digging it, we'll try out someone else there. We normally don't have anyone stuck in the entire role the entire time, but it does occasionally happen when things feel like they're going right. I recommend reviewing the roles and expectations up front. So when you start things out, to let everyone know kind of who will start in what role and what you're going to be looking for, kind of giving everyone a big picture idea of like, hey, what's the flow for this that we're going to be doing? So what makes a successful mob session? So when I started utilizing the mob testing concept, I hadn't yet read about any best practices, but I felt it was easier than doing what we were currently doing, which was failing miserably at kind of getting everyone together and having this really large negative communication loop. So when I started out, I tried a few sessions and they just felt really, really awkward. I didn't have defined roles. I didn't really know about those defined roles yet. And I didn't really have a good plan of attack. It kind of started out with people looking at me asking like, what should we do? You got us all here. You made the invite. And I was unsure. I went through the listed requirements that we had and I might look at the design, but it just wasn't working out. So we get quicker feedback comparatively to what we were doing, but I don't think we were actively focused on how it should be going. So we would leave the session and we'd feel unsatisfied, but I couldn't articulate why. And so that's when I kind of looked in like, hey, well, what makes this successful? So the first thing that you're going to be doing that's going to make this successful is kindness, respect, and consideration. We should be kind to each other, and we should make sure that we're able to be open, and it helps everyone feel comfortable in giving their ideas, regardless of what the idea is. So someone has an idea that you don't like, you still go along with it. That's being kind. We should respect each other's times and opinions. So the big thing to remember is the people attending these sessions, they're taking time out of their day to sit with you and actively kind of look at what you're testing. That's not something they necessarily have to do, but oftentimes it's something they want to do, but it's just something to remember when you're going through that. This means that you shouldn't have things like distractions. You shouldn't be on your computer. You shouldn't be, texting on your phone or whatever. You want to be focused. And you can tell when someone isn't focused. So especially when you're in person, you can tell when, someone else is kind of pulling up their computer and being like, oh, this is what's going on. Or that they're kind of like looking around. They're not really focused on what you're specifically looking at. I think this also means, in a sense, coming prepared. So you want to come in having a general knowledge of what's being looked at. So if you have a meeting and the information shared ahead of time, which hopefully it is, you're looking at that and reviewing it. You're going in knowing this is what we're testing and why. And then, as I said, respecting other people's opinions. Even if they're drastically different than your own, you want to make sure you're respecting that. By using this as a guideline, it helps to prevents non-productive conflict. And it creates the psychological safety net needed to comfortably make things happen. Second key is the yes and mentality. So this means when you make a role change for the driver, you don't switch to a new idea, but rather you continue the thing you were working on and finish another person's idea. So if you're going and you're midway on testing a flow and you decide to switch because maybe one person isn't comfortable in a role, you're continuing that flow. You're not just saying, okay, we're midway through, we're going to do something completely different. If there's more than one idea proposed for what should come next and time allows, do them both. There's no reason not to. It applies the same way that if you all have ever seen like an improv show or like Whose Line It Anyway, something like that. When someone gives an idea, you don't say, no, we're not doing this. You take it and you build upon it. And that helps make it stronger and it keeps the flow going nicely. So we try to work out and build upon the ideas, which makes for a much more rewarding session. Include others. The third key is including the coworkers who interact with the product whom you might not consider in a traditional testing session. So this could include marketing team members, it could include engineers not directly involved, as well as other product people. And it could also include things like your customer services or customer success team. From my experience, when we include those folks in the mob sessions, they act as fresh eyes for the group. And many of the other stakeholders have seen this thing again and again. So I don't know if you have all have ever brought in someone new. They look at it and they go, what about this? What about that? That's what we're trying to get out of that perspective. They can point out confusing experiences. They can point out things that the customer might see and say, that doesn't make sense to me. Now, if you're inviting someone and it's their first time you're inviting them to a session, I personally like to try and do a reach out rather than just like including them on an invite. I like to Slack them and say, hey, look, we're going to be doing a group testing session. I really want to include you because I value your perspective. I think you'd be really good at telling us about X or Y that's, you think a customer flow might be confusing. And if they're representative of a group, so let's say that you're inviting a customer service representative who represents all of customer service, I like to also ask that they talk to their team to let them know this is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to this testing group meeting. Are there any questions or concerns you all might want me to raise or things in particular you would like me to bring up? Having a guide. So have something to act as a guide as it gives your mob session some structure. So it could be a testing plan, it could be a checklist of the parts of the product, it could be your requirements, but you don't have to have something super formal, but you want to have something. As I mentioned, when I started out, I didn't really have too much. I had the requirements, but even then, it felt like it just made for an awkward session overall. So having a little more detail and having kind of a checklist, it really helps, in my opinion, make it go far. It prevents you also from going too off tangent. So if you're going and you find this weird case and you go off on another thing, it can help loop you back to what you need to hit and to make sure you don't miss any areas. So you could get done the session and you could say, oh, we're good. But if you didn't have a checklist, you might think everything's fine. When you do have it, you can say, what about this? We might have missed this or that. In our organization, what we do is we sync with the product manager and we work with them to write a testing plan, which acts as our guide for that. We also have a checklist of everything that we want to reach and hit within the group session we have. So we recently had a mob session for an editing tool, which on our site is called Maker. And before starting, we created a testing plan of the various account types we wanted to look at with the session. Without this list, I'm pretty certain we would have missed an account type or an experience. And on our site, if you miss one of those account types, that means there's an entire group of customers who is not able to see the new feature that we want to share with everyone. The Navigator should be given this guide ahead of time so that they are familiar with the expectations and they can kind of help set the priorities and make sure that everything is covered. While having a guide is really great and helps maintain the structure, I think you should always make time for exploratory testing. So exploratory testing involves thinking beyond the scope of what you set out to test and asking, what happens if? So what happens if you click this button? What happens if you send this request? What happens if you try to go back in the browser? What happens if you send a certain command that you shouldn't? Basically thinking outside the box. And those are the things that help you find issues that you may not otherwise show until it reaches a customer and someone reaches out in customer service and says, hey, this doesn't make sense. This customer found this bug. We were recently doing a test where we had an update on our sign-up flows to show a new layout on the page where we input our payment information. We had an issue where this toggle for monthly and annual plans under certain circumstances would sign you up for the incorrect plan. We found this out due to someone asking, what happens if you click here and then you go back? That was the exploratory part of that. Without the curiosity being encouraged and without someone saying and asking that question, we wouldn't have discovered this bug. And we would have had some pretty upset customers who would have been signed up for a plan they didn't intend to be signed up for. That being said, if you find that your session is basically becoming a giant exploratory session, just kind of see if that's okay. And a lot of times, if you have a lot to go over, you might want to kind of circle back and say like, hey, this doesn't work. If you see people getting anxious, if you see people are no longer engaged in it, and it just becomes you and one person having a session, it might be good to kind of go back and have the Navigator reaffirm the focus of what the mob session is about. Take your time, ask questions. In sessions where I felt rushed, I was a lot less likely to take suggestions for exploratory testing or actively listen. And instead, I was paying attention to the clock. I might have had a meeting right after. And so I was looking, okay, what time is it? Do I have any Slacks coming in about this? I need to make sure I get out of here in time. So I recommend kind of adding an additional little bit of time as a buffer to it. So that way you have the extra like half hour, something of that nature. When we encounter a part of the product where something looks off, we like to ask questions to the group as to what they think we should do. We'd ask the product, what should this say? It isn't right compared with like the requirements or something of that nature. So definitely take the time to ask questions, ask for the feedback. You have all of those people in a room, and so if you don't get their feedback, then you're not taking advantage of the active mob idea and the session you have there. I also suggest making sure that, as I said, you're adding a bunch of people to the invite whose input is going to be valued so that you can ask them questions. And sometimes, as I said, those new people are the ones who are going to give you the best stuff. So the question of how much prep work should be done before the mob session, frankly, it's something I still struggle with now. The rule of thumb I now use is if the thing you would prepare takes more than a few minutes to set up and doesn't potentially show related experience issues, set it up ahead of time. So 2 examples here of good and bad. I once ran a session on a part of our product where we upload our content for the videos and the audio and the images we have on our site. And we didn't really have great seed data in the environment where we were uploading this stuff to. So we had to go in and manually create the accounts. The first time we ran the session, we didn't do that ahead of time. And so we thought, oh, this is going to be quick. We went in. The entirety of that hour that we had was actually spent creating the accounts. We had to go in there, we had to add permissions for them. And so it turned out, it just felt like a waste of time. Everyone kind of left being like, we didn't really test anything. We ran a second session where we went in, we made the items ahead of time, and it felt a lot faster. We were able to go in, we were able to click in there right away. In cases like this, especially where the test depends on the data that you have, like if you're testing certain account types, try to create it ahead of time. On the other hand, we had sessions where we're testing different member types. We have a new sign-up flow that we had there, and we wanted to make sure that they were able to perform certain functionality. We created the accounts ahead of time, but when we went in, the accounts themselves weren't working. They were having some issues. So we actually decided, okay, it's quick to sign up these members. Let's go ahead and do it. And that actually worked in our favor because it only took a minute or two to do it live. We actually got to see some sign-up flows and people weren't as familiar with those. So it kind of helped spread the knowledge to those who weren't normally clicking around in that part of product, what to do. Temporary channels. So this is one of my favorite things to do that I think can be kind of extended outside of this. But with my first 2 mob testing sessions, I would get a group together. I'd have a great discussion and find a bunch of bugs. Things were kind of looking up, they're improving, but then when I wanted to discuss the follow-ups or make additional requests or have another mob session, I didn't really have a good place to do it. I wound up like creating a group Slack message or putting a thread on a channel, and there were cases where someone wasn't already on that channel, so I had to invite them and add them. So it just had a giant communication problem. And I thought, hey, there has to be a better way to do this. So as I said, this is like an example of a thread where it didn't go well. You know, you have 135 plus replies. It's an outlier, but you can imagine having to scroll through all of that. So what we do instead is we create a temporary channel. Temporary Slack channels are a really easy way to have a single source of truth for a given project. They let you invite others who can easily see where the conversation begins, and they provide a place for all relevant details related to the test. It also makes it easier when you have private channels or something. You don't have to invite someone who shouldn't be there. Everyone can be involved and everyone can be invited. For us, they also act as a way to discuss something we want to test, but say we don't have a large enough group for a mob session. So if there's only a handful of us, we can get all the parties we need involved in an async discussion, and we can also inform everyone of the progress on the state of things we are testing. Furthermore, I think you can take this idea and you can apply it to other parts of the software development lifecycle. So if you want to have a channel for grooming something, if you want to have a channel just for a discussion, you can take all of the people who would be involved as stakeholders and you can put them in that channel. I also suggest kind of having a consistent naming convention to make things easier for the group should you have multiple channels active at the same time. So we use a format of what you see here, temp/channel/ whatever /QA. In the specific instance, we were checking out an A/B test where we wanted to see the impact of updating a clip previews on a video site. When I create the channels, I always include the link to the ticket from Notion or Jira, which is where I have the list of the requirements. I include the design, which shows how things should look and what visual expectations are. A testing plan or test cases or whatever you're using that's equivalent to that. If you're not testing in production, the testing link where the items can be tested. So the environment, and if you are testing in production, what is the feature flag? What is everyone using for that? And then I also include a QA sheet. For the QA sheet, we have a template. And we have a template where you can just go ahead and copy and paste it, and then you put it in for the specific instance. So it could be QA, whatever. We use the same one across all of our testing, as that's what our teams have become familiar with. So I ask for everyone to look it over and ask any questions they have, especially when we're doing mob sessions, to see that they're prepared and that they know what's going to be on there. Recently for the templates, we were previously using Google Slides or Google Sheets. We started using Notion instead because we found it was a lot more collaborative, and we make it so that people can easily take the template that we have and they can add columns. So if we consistently see that we need a column for assigned engineer, which is one we recently added, we can do that on a given project, and we can also copy and delete on a given project. But the template has everything we're going to be needing for that. And as I said, I think finding a more collaborative tool has been really helpful. It kind of makes it easier, and it's been well liked by all of our respective engineers and stakeholders. I use the channel to indicate progress for what we're testing. So for example, indicating what feature is deployed to production, or when we're ready to review and do another round of testing. Now, if you're using tickets, say you're using Jira, instead of Google Sheet or something like that, one thing you can also that's really cool that we were able to do with Slack is you can integrate your ticket software into the channel. So it'll show automatic updates when changes to the ticket are made. Now, one important thing to do when you're all done, make sure you get into the habit of resolving and archiving the channels you create, or whatever the equivalent it is for other similar software you're using. It's a good indication that the project is complete, and it keeps your Slack from not being too clogged up with channels no longer being used. So that way you don't have like 100 temp channels. You know that when you look at a temp channel, those are the only ones that have active projects. I also recommend that once the mob testing session is complete, review what you found. On our tracking sheet, we have a way to assign each action in a status of ready to be checked, ready for additional rounds of testing, it's resolved, set as a fast follow-up, in which case we might have to make a ticket for it to look at in the future. Will not implement, meaning it's something we decide not to proceed with or requiring additional input and needing more input from design or more input from product. And then what we do is we can add the next steps in the Slack channel and we get input there if we need to. We set a priority for those items. So as a group, we discuss in the session, hey, here are the items, here's what needs to be done, here's a priority. And then after reviewing, if there are things that need to be done, we can assign those out to individuals. So we have the column for engineer, as I said, especially if there are multiple engineers on a single project or multiple product people, it makes it easier to say, like, this is the person taking care of it. They're now in charge of that particular item. And if the items are out of scope, so let's say you're doing an A/B test, you can add something too for like a fast follow on rollout if the item is rolled out. So kind of like a quick review here: kindness, respect, consideration, building off each other, including others, having a guide, allowing exploratory testing, slow down and ask questions, prep if less than a few minutes, use temp channels, and follow up. Kind of the great traits here. So what are the benefits of mob testing? Kind of covered what makes a good session, but you might be asking now, like, why should I use this technique? So mob testing in some way has kind of become a regular part of our quality assurance process. For most medium and large features, we make sure to have some version of a session where we get together and we discuss things. We found it has many positive impacts. The first being improved communication. So before I started using mob testing as a regular practice, my frustration came from being out of the loop of the updates to requirements or the updates to design and having to go through multiple people and channels to get the answers to the question that I had. So I don't know if any of you have ever played the game Telephone. It's kind of like that. You have something the first person is told, and the goal is to go through a line of kids to get to the final person to see how much the thing that you said originally has changed. So let's say that I said Ben ate potato salad for lunch. It might wind up saying Ben ate a baked potato with a salad. I was having something similar happen with a lot of the stuff I was doing where it's like it got misconstrued through multiple people, and so it wasn't the original thing that was being said. It felt like I was playing that game just with grown-ups in a situation where I was the tester. Instead of having to go through multiple people to discuss something or get a question answered, in a mob testing session, everyone's in the same room or they're in the same Slack channel, so you can get immediate feedback and answers to your questions. Other participants now know what questions and responses are, so they don't have to ask the same question if they came up with a thought of like, hey, should I do X? They can look and see, oh, we already asked about X. We've already talked about it. And they can get them answered in a pretty quick time frame. They also don't have to worry about who do I reach out to, because more often than not, everyone's in the same channel. So they can just ask a general group question and the appropriate person can take the time to discuss it. It builds relationships. Communication also can be seen outside of mob testing. So having worked with someone and brainstorm ideas with them, it's a really great way to kind of build relationships with your teammates, especially in like the COVID world we have now, where I would normally see someone in person and I could chat with them. Having them in a group mob session has given me the chance to chat with them and kind of see what their process is and understand their thinking. I think it also kind of helps build trust because they know that you are a good resource for whatever it is you're looking at. You get earlier stakeholder input. There's nothing more frustrating than when you build a project, you think everything is fixed, and upon setting it live into the world to see your work, you have a stakeholder who was minimally involved, maybe like at the beginning, sees some part of the finished product and says, what's that? Why is it that way? We should change this. And I would see that happen from time to time. And it would be a really big pain point for everyone involved because you had this big hurrah. You had all these people working together to get this big thing out the door. And suddenly they have to go back and make edits or modify it, or they might have to change like the analytics. Mob testing, you can get those stakeholders involved in the testing process at the same phase as everyone else. So they're getting their input earlier before the product is live for the customer. So an example of this was with the rollout of 3 domains to 1. So we had all of our domains come into 1 and we had them formatted in a particular way. So we got the feedback there in the mob session versus later. And I know previous to the mob sessions, the stakeholder who was giving the input was often one who at that time, after everything's rolled out, would be like, hey, can you make a change here? So you're able to get things done and we didn't have to worry about making modifications afterwards. Improves future communication. Especially in large companies, you may run into situations where you're deploying a feature directly impacting other features, either something that's live, something that's currently being tested, or something that's in planning. By having stakeholders who work on different projects in the same room, you may be able to flag a part of the product you're currently testing that would impact something that the stakeholder who's in the room is working on too. Without the mob testing session, they might not have otherwise known about this until it came out. So we most commonly see this with stuff related to our API. So if we have someone in the room who is on our API team, they can flag a change that's coming out. So for example, if we're rolling out something new with content types or new filters, they can say, hey, that's something we should include in the API documentation. They can make a ticket for it, flag it to their team, and then it gets done at the same time rather than after it's been rolled out and the customer raises it. It also gets people in your organization using the product, which from my experience, some people aren't using a part of the product or they're not particularly involved with day to day. So let's say you have a search page and a sign up page. If they're in a sign up page, they might not be using the search page all the time. But in these group sessions, well, now they're involved. And when they're thinking about changes they're going to make to the product, they can think, oh, what should I be doing? how should I be included in this? And they can think about the stuff that needs to be done for that. It teaches others testing gaps. So it allows others to see how you test and what your thinking process is when you test. So when I voice my opinion for something we should check, especially if it's exploratory in nature, I like to kind of explain my logic. Why? Why am I thinking that way? What do I think we might find there? And I think this helps stakeholders better understand flows and logic that they might not think on their own. And when they build features in the future, they're hopefully thinking about those and they're wondering how will those things interact with other parts. I've also seen the benefit of now others in my organization actually inviting me to mob sessions. I have one of those later this week where we're getting together and we're kind of chatting about an upcoming feature that's having. And so it's great to have other people do it as well. Reduces testing time and deployment time. So our average time to test a feature before it's in the customer's hands when we use mob testing for the majority of the testing on a medium and large feature is on average 1 to a few days. When we do it without mob testing, it's a few days to a week. I think it's because without getting everyone in a room, we have that communication gap where we have to see what comments someone had. We have to talk to everyone else. We have to get feedback before we can go ahead and make a modification or a change. But when we have everyone together, we know all stakeholders have had the opportunity to test. We can get all the questions answered. And we don't have to wait and wonder, what is the stakeholder's input going to be? Gets the feature out quickly, makes everyone, including customers, happy. I think it also allows people to give more of a sign off on it, verbally or written in the Slack channel saying it's good to go, rather than having to reach out to everyone individually and say, are you good with this? Are you good with this? Reduces bugs in product. So as I mentioned in the beginning, mob testing grew out of mob programming. The process of getting others together to provide input and improve team dynamics and make things more efficient can be applied to other areas in the product lifecycle. For example, we use it with testing plans and requirements for upcoming features, and we often are able to catch bugs that we might have not found until the QA phase earlier. So our organization has grown pretty heavily over the last year or two, and we've increased the size of our engineering team, total number of projects by at least a third, but the total number of our medium and our large high severity bugs has stayed pretty consistent month to month. Mob testing isn't the only reason for this, but I definitely think that it has a large impact on it. I think having the fresh eyes and having the people come in and take a look at it, it helps make sure that they've kind of gone in there and seen it and they can give the input and ask the questions, which avoids the bugs that you're going to have later in production. It also helps kind of with the shift left mentality. So I know that's a big thing in testing right now where it's like you're testing earlier. As I said, I think you can create sessions for getting together and testing something before it's actually in the QA phase. So you could have a session for grooming. You could have a session for writing requirements or looking at design, which gets QA and testers involved as early as possible, which is the whole idea of this shift left. So quick review. I think it improves communication, builds relationships, gets earlier stakeholder input, improves future products, teaches others to see testing gaps, reduces testing time and deployments, reduces bugs, and kind of helps shift left. So I realize much of what I've said is specific to and easier to implement in person. So when COVID started becoming a thing, my company went 100% remote. And like many other companies, we were kind of thinking it was temporary. We tried kind of holding off on sessions or figuring out what to do. And then it became more of a permanent thing. And so we thought, okay, like we have to figure this out. We want to make sure we're still getting the group input. How do we adapt? And how do we go about making sure this still works? Have a kickoff meeting. So this is similar to what I said when you start out. You get everyone together to kind of go over it, but we start out with a separate meeting for that. Like the first 10 or 15 minutes, it's a meeting to get everyone together. Even if they're not involved with the mob testing session, it could be just stakeholders who we let them know what's going on. And we say, hey, here's what we're going to test. Here's our testing plan. Here's what's out of scope, what we're not going to be looking at. And here are ways that you can go about testing it. Let's get going. It also gives some good energy behind what we're going to be doing. It's like, woo, let's do it. Minor rule changes. So the remote sessions, one thing we've done is we've done minor changes as far as switching the roles for the driver and the mob. We assign the parts out of our testing plan of certain test cases to each participant, and we rotate. So this allows the driver to be the one sharing their screen and clicking around. The navigator and note taker and the mob mostly stay the same. Focus on the session. It's a lot harder remotely to know if someone's distracted. In person, if you're doing one computer or you're rotating, you can tell that's the one being used. It's the main focus of the group. Now, with Slack and with all the other communication things we have available, people can turn their they can turn their video and audio off, and they can just play a game. They could do another task. Remote, I recommend asking people to kind of turn on their video, turn on their audio, and just be part of the experience and focus on what everyone is looking at. So that way we can tell if someone's distracted, and then mute Slack in the background, mute whatever you're looking at in the background. So that way you can make sure that they're paying attention. Take breaks. I think it's really important, especially if you're in a session that's longer. Take 5 minutes and get everyone to stretch. You know, it's really hard to stare at a screen for an hour and a half or whatever, looking and really attentively focusing on something. So I think getting out and moving around really helps with that. Use the video sharing features. So things like Zoom, they have features for chat. They have features for annotation. I personally find that if you have something you want to add, it's a really great way to add that information in the middle of a session without stopping and interrupting if someone's in the middle of something. Navigator can come back to those later, and they can say, okay, let's try and look at that. You can also annotate really easily. So if you have something where you're wanting to check it and you can't really, like, you're trying to describe it and they don't see what you're looking at, you can use the annotation to kind of look at that. Smaller groups. So smaller group sessions, I think, are a little bit easier to deal with, especially when remote, because if you have 8 to 10 people in a room in a Zoom, sometimes it's difficult to not have people talk over each other. And I think sometimes people can really check out, as I said. I think just keeping it smaller sessions, even if you have more of those smaller sessions, is a really great way to kind of combat that. Well, not an exact like mob testing session if it's only 3 or 4. I think it has the spirit of the idea. So, as I said, kicking off with a beginning session, minor role changes. You want to definitely focus and take breaks, and you want to use the video sharing features and have smaller group sessions. Next steps. So if you haven't had any experience with mob testing yet, definitely give it a go. I encourage you to reach out to those whose feedback you see yourself asking for frequently and see what you can set up. If you can't do a mob testing session, try making a channel. Just try and get the communication to happen in one place. Even if it's not a full large group, it can be really beneficial to have all communication happen in one area. And don't be afraid to switch things up as you go. We're still kind of experimenting on our side. You know, we constantly have to go back to the basics sometimes to be like, how do we change this? How do we modify it? And I work on many different teams, and I think each team kind of has a different way of doing this that works best for them. So don't be afraid to try that out on your own. And finally, thank you for taking the time to kind of come to my talk. Definitely want to thank James and STP for giving me a chance to talk. And if there's anything you want to discuss or ask about outside of this, just feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. That was a great presentation, a great deep dive into mob testing. So thank you. We do have a few questions here if you're ready.
Sure thing. Go ahead.
All right. First one is, how many hours do you guys mob?
It varies week by week. It depends. Normally, we have at least 1 or 2 medium to large features each week, and we now have a few additional people on our team, but I would say on average, probably 3 to 4 hours a week. Normally, we've gotten to the point where we've kind of had some sessions before to kind of discuss about it, and then the session we're having is a pretty focused QA that we're doing of the feature that we're looking at. We try to break those up into smaller bits if we can, just to make it easier to focus on the one thing we're looking at.
Great answer. Perfect. Next question, have you seen a drop off or an increase of mob sessions due to moving remote in the last year?
I somewhat. So I think when we initially went remote, yes, it was a lot harder. Especially with fatigue of like now with I think with COVID, if you want to talk to someone where you could before go in person and say, hey, James, I need something. You have to send a Slack or you have an email or something like that. And I think people in our organization definitely have meeting fatigue. So we did see some degree of a drop off, but I think we've kind of gotten better about it. We've kept the sessions tighter. We've been more focused, and we're trying to go in knowing what we want to look at, how we want to look at, and having less overall time to just kind of like chat. We have more of an agenda and more of a focus when we're going into the sessions.
Perfect. I think this kind of builds off the other one. Let's see. How often, and you might have answered this with that question, but how often do you mob?
Yeah. A few times, normally once or twice a week for medium or large features. As I said, sometimes it's grooming stuff in an earlier phase. More often than not, it's the QA session itself, where I'm normally the one leading them. I have been invited to other ones by some product managers recently, which is really cool, but I'll miss myself doing it for a few hours a week.
Perfect. That's all the questions we have, and thank you so much. We loved your presentation. And hopefully next time we see you, it will be in person at an in-person event.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Before we go, just a couple reminders. Join us for Thomas Haver's workshop, How to Build a Successful Automation Framework with BDD in mind, and learn how to write automated scenarios, handle test data, implement continuous integration, and much, much more. The 2-day virtual workshop is on June 9th and June 16th, and you can register at SoftwareTestPro.com today. Also, our next scheduled webinar will take place on June 2nd. Ryan Ruska will be giving a presentation on cookie consent and how you can test across multiple languages. Visit SoftwareTestPro.com to sign up for this webinar and view the upcoming webinars from STP in 2021. And if you'd like to be considered for a webinar presentation or have an idea for a great testing topic, visit SoftwareTestPro.com to submit your proposal. And with that, thank you so much, Ben. We enjoyed having you. And thank you everyone who attended the webinar today. Have a great day and stay safe.